Some say it never happened, that no single farmer could have stood against the notorious Black River Gang. But those who were there, who witnessed what unfolded in the autumn of 1873, they know the truth of what happens when evil men mistake silence for weakness. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's story will leave you speechless. Pine Valley was barely a dot on any map, just another struggling settlement carved into the wilderness of Montana Territory. A single dirt road wound through scattered homesteads, past a modest general store, a weather-beaten church, and the only saloon for 20 miles. The land was harsh, unforgiving, but beneath its rugged surface lay some of the richest soil this side of the Mississippi, the kind of soil that could make a man wealthy if he knew how to work it, or dead if the wrong people took notice. Old Sarah Cooper, who ran the general store with an iron fist and a sharper tongue, remembered the day everything began to change. It was early spring, when the mountain snow was just starting to melt, and hope was as thin as the morning frost. The store's bell rang, and in walked a stranger leading a tired mule loaded down with farming tools. He wasn't much to look at. Medium height, weathered clothes, the kind of face you'd forget as soon as you turned away. But Sarah had survived 30 years on the frontier by noticing what others missed, and something about this stranger made her instincts prick like a cat's ears at distant thunder. His name was Marcus Reed, he said, speaking soft and polite as he bought supplies. His hands caught her attention first. They were strong enough, sure, but they lacked the thick calluses you'd expect from a lifetime of farming. And his eyes. They had that careful way of watching, always knowing where everyone stood in the room. She'd seen eyes like that before, back when her late husband rode with the cavalry. Reed bought old Johnson's abandoned plot on the north end of the valley, the one most folks said was too rocky to farm. Paid in cash, kept to himself, and started working that supposedly worthless land with a patience that made even veteran farmers take notice. Every morning, he'd be out there before dawn, methodically clearing rocks, tilling soil, setting fence posts with the precision of a man marking distances for something far more important than farming. The valley had its share of secrets in those days, and plenty of reasons to keep them. The soil in Pine Valley wasn't just good, it was exceptional, rich enough to grow crops that would fetch triple the price in any market back east. But that kind of wealth attracts attention, and attention was the last thing the valley needed with the Black River Gang pushing their way north through the territory. Wade Timberwolf Morrison had started small, just another outlaw with big dreams and a fast gun. But he was smarter than most, knew that real power wasn't in quick raids and stolen gold, but in owning the land itself. He'd already taken 3 valleys to the south, using a combination of threats, fire, and lead, to convince farmers to sell their land for pennies on the dollar. Those who refused had a way of disappearing, their farms mysteriously burning down on moonless nights. The Cooper family knew better than most what Morrison was capable of. Sarah's son Thomas had been sheriff in Last Chance Valley before the gang moved in. He'd tried to stand against them, organize the farmers to resist. They found him one morning on his own porch, shot 7 times, his badge missing and a wolf's fang left in its place. Morrison's calling card, they said. Nobody paid much mind to Marcus Reed in those early days. He was just another farmer trying to scratch life from stubborn earth. Nobody noticed how he'd sometimes pause in his work, head tilted just so, like he was listening to something far off in the distance. Or how his eyes would track riders passing on the road with the same careful attention he gave to plotting his furrows. Even when he came to town for supplies, he moved quiet as a shadow, watching, listening, learning the rhythm of the valley. Young Billy Cooper, Sarah's grandson, was probably the first to suspect something wasn't quite what it seemed with the new farmer. Billy was 12, sharp as a tack and twice as curious. He'd taken to watching Reed's farm from the hills above, fascinated by the stranger's methodical way of working. One morning, he saw something that set his mind spinning. Reed was checking his fence line when a hawk swooped low chasing a rabbit. Without seeming to aim, without even properly looking, Reed snatched up a stone and threw it. The hawk tumbled, stunned but unhurt, while the rabbit escaped. It was the kind of throw that shouldn't have been possible. Too fast, too precise, like the stone knew where it needed to go before it left his hand. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, you need to understand what Pine Valley was before the storm broke, before a single farmer showed the whole territory that sometimes the deadliest weapon a man can carry isn't strapped to his hip, but hidden behind a humble smile and calloused hands. You need to understand what it means when a man who spent his life perfecting the art of death decides instead to pursue the art of making things grow, and what happens when evil men mistake that choice for weakness. As spring melted into summer, dark clouds gathered over Pine Valley, though not a drop of rain fell from the Montana sky. Word of the Black River Gang's approach spread through the settlement like wildfire in drought season. They started subtle, the way a wolf pack tests its prey before the kill. First came the riders, just passing through, they said, asking casual questions about water rights and crop yields. They'd stop at Matthew Parker's saloon, loose with their money and free with their threats, bragging about what happened to folks down south who didn't know how to be reasonable. Sheriff Daniel Hayes watched it all from his office, a worried crease deepening between his eyes. He was a good man, folks said, but good wasn't always enough against the kind of evil that was riding toward their valley. He'd known Thomas Cooper, seen what happened when a lawman stood alone against Morrison's pack. His badge felt heavier with each passing day, like it was made of lead instead of tin. The first real trouble came at the Henderson place. Jack Henderson was a proud man, worked his spread for 20 years, raised 3 kids on that land. One morning he found his irrigation ditch dammed up, the water diverted away from his crops. When he went to clear it, 2 riders appeared, casual as you please, guns visible on their hips. "Shame about the water," one said, picking his teeth with a knife. "Lot of accidents happening lately. Course, Mr. Morrison's offering fair prices for land. Better to sell than watch everything you built just dry up and blow away." Henderson had no choice. He sold for a quarter of what the land was worth, packed his family in their wagon, and headed east. Others followed: the Millers, the Richardsons, the Worthy family with their prize horses. Each sale came with a story of accidents that couldn't be proven, of midnight visits and morning devastation. Through it all, Marcus Reed kept working his rocky plot on the north end, seemingly absorbed in his endless task of clearing fields and mending fences. But Sarah Cooper noticed how his eyes would narrow whenever Morrison's men rode past, how his hands would tighten on his tools like they were something else entirely. She caught him one evening as he was buying supplies, his usual order of seeds and tools. "You hear about the Hendersons?" she asked, measuring out coffee beans with practiced precision. "Hard not to," Reed replied, his voice soft as always but with something underneath it, like steel wrapped in wool. "Morrison's men were in here earlier, asking about you, about your land." Reed's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes did. "Were they now? And what did you tell them, Mrs. Cooper?" "That you're just another fool trying to farm rocks." She paused, then added lower, "But you're not, are you? No real farmer holds a hoe like it's a rifle, or measures his fence posts like he's ranging distances." For a long moment, Reed said nothing, just studied her with those 2 sharp eyes. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, Mrs. Cooper, the best way to protect something isn't to fight for it, but to grow it, to nurture it until it's strong enough to stand on its own." That night, young Billy Cooper couldn't sleep. He snuck out to his hiding place in the hills above Reed's farm, watching the mysterious farmer work by moonlight. What he saw would haunt his dreams for years to come. Reed wasn't farming. He was measuring, pacing, marking distances. Every few yards he'd stop, check the wind, make a note in a small book. His movements were different too. Gone was the farmer's awkward shuffle, replaced by something fluid and deadly. When an owl swooped overhead, Reed's hand moved like lightning to his hip, though no gun hung there. The motion was pure instinct, smooth as breathing, the mark of a man who'd drawn and fired more times than he could count. Billy ran home through the darkness, his mind racing. He had to tell his grandmother what he'd seen, but by morning, everything had changed. The Williams family's barn burned in the night, their prized stallion trapped inside. Morrison's men were getting bolder, and Pine Valley's time was running out. Next time, we'll see how the tension continues to build as Morrison himself arrives in Pine Valley, and the truth about Marcus Reed begins to surface. Wade Timberwolf Morrison rode into Pine Valley at high noon, 3 days after the Williamses' barn burning. He didn't come with guns blazing or a show of force. Instead, he arrived like a businessman, well-dressed and mannerly, with just 4 riders flanking him. But there was nothing civilized about the fear that rippled through town at his approach, or the way his eyes seemed to measure everything, and everyone, in terms of profit and loss. Sarah Cooper watched from her store window as Morrison dismounted outside Parker's saloon. He moved with the lazy confidence of a man who'd never faced real opposition, his gun belt worn high and tight. Not a gunslinger's rig, but a killer's all the same. The wolf's fang necklace he wore caught the sunlight, a reminder of the fate that had befallen her son. "Quite the welcome committee," Morrison remarked to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "You'd think folks had never seen a man looking to invest in their community before." The laugh that followed held no warmth, like winter wind through dead trees. Sheriff Hayes emerged from his office, badge gleaming, but his hand nowhere near his gun. Smart man. Morrison's riders had already spread out, taking positions that gave them clear lines of fire across the street. "Mr. Morrison," Hayes said, his voice steady despite the tension. "We weren't expecting you." "Best kind of visit, wouldn't you say?" "Keeps things honest." Morrison's smile never reached his eyes. "I hear you've got some of the richest soil in the territory. Shame to see it worked by folks who don't have the resources to make the most of it." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Reed, driving his mule-drawn wagon loaded with farm supplies. He seemed oblivious to the tension, to the way Morrison's men had their hands near their guns. He simply guided his wagon through the crowd, nodding politely to those he passed. Morrison's attention snapped to the newcomer like a predator catching an unfamiliar scent. "Don't believe we've met," he called out. "Wade Morrison, at your service. I'm looking to invest in local properties, build something special here in Pine Valley." Reed secured his mule before turning, his movements unhurried. "Marcus Reed," he replied simply. "Just a farmer trying to grow something worthwhile." But Sarah Cooper, watching from her doorway, saw how he positioned himself, subtle, almost unconscious, but putting him in perfect view of all Morrison's men while keeping his back to a wall. "Farmer, eh?" Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "Heard about your place up north? Rocky soil, poor water. Can't be easy making a living up there." "Good things rarely come easy, Mr. Morrison." Reed's voice remained mild, but something in his tone made Morrison's closest rider shift uneasily in his saddle. "True enough. But life's full of opportunities if you know where to look. My associates and I might be interested in taking that burden off your hands. Fair price, of course." Reed seemed to consider this, head tilted slightly as if listening to distant music. "Appreciate the offer," he said finally. "But I've put down roots. Hard thing to do in rocky soil. Makes you reluctant to pull them up." The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Morrison's smile became a razor's edge. "Roots can wither mighty quick in this climate. Seen it happen too many times. Man's better off taking a fairer offer while it's on the table." "Maybe." Reed began unloading his supplies, his movements precise and measured. "But I've always believed that anything worth having is worth fighting for, whether it's crops pushing through stone or men standing their ground." Before Morrison could respond, commotion erupted from the south end of town. A rider was coming in fast, one of Morrison's scouts, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He dismounted in a rush, whispering urgently in his boss's ear. Whatever news he brought caused Morrison's face to darken like storm clouds gathering. "We'll continue this discussion later," Morrison said, his casual tone belied by the tension in his shoulders. He turned to Hayes. "Sheriff, you might want to ride out to the old Carson place. Seems there's been another unfortunate accident." As Morrison and his men rode south, Sarah Cooper hurried to where Reed still stood, calmly unloading his wagon. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met," she said quietly, "or the biggest fool." Reed's hands never paused in their work. "There's a third option, Mrs. Cooper." His voice was soft, meant for her ears alone. "Sometimes a man chooses his ground carefully, knowing exactly what's coming and how to meet it." Young Billy Cooper, who had been watching everything from his perch on the store's porch, suddenly spoke up. "I saw you last night, Mr. Reed. Saw how you move when you think no one's watching. Saw you practicing." Reed turned to the boy, something like sadness crossing his features. "And what exactly did you see, Billy? You weren't measuring for farming. You were measuring distances, sight lines, like my pa used to do when he was teaching me to shoot." Billy's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're getting ready for something." "Smart boy." Reed nodded. "Too smart to go spreading stories, I hope. At least until the right time." Sarah grabbed her grandson's shoulder protectively. "What are you?" "Really?" Reed secured the last of his supplies before answering. "Just a man who learned long ago that there are two ways to deal with wolves. You can hunt them, track them, try to kill them one by one. Or you can build something they can't tear down, gather good people together, make a stand that matters." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Cooper. Billy." As Reed drove his wagon north, Sheriff Hayes approached Sarah's store, his face grim. "Carson Place is burning," he said without preamble. "Old man Carson tried to stand up to them. They ... He couldn't finish." Sarah's hand went to her throat, where she kept her son's spare badge on a chain. "Daniel," she said, using the sheriff's first name for the first time in years, "what are we going to do?" Hayes watched Reed's wagon disappearing toward the north end of the valley. "Maybe nothing," he said thoughtfully. "That new farmer of yours, something familiar about him. Way he moves, way he takes in everything. Reminds me of stories I heard during the war about a sharpshooter who worked for the army. Man, they said, could hit a playing card at 400 yards. Never knew his name, but they called him Ghost because he'd set up his shots days in advance, plan everything down to the last detail. By the time you knew he was there, it was already too late." "You think Reed is this Ghost?" "I think Morrison just picked a fight without knowing who he's really fighting. And I think things in Pine Valley are about to get real interesting." As if to punctuate his words, a single shot rang out from the north end of the valley. Clear, precise, echoing off the mountains like thunder. Someone was target practicing, though no one had seen Reed carry a rifle. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a warning, a promise, a measurement of things to come. The war for Pine Valley was about to begin, though not in the way anyone expected. Not even Morrison, with all his cunning, could have guessed that his greatest enemy would turn out to be a quiet farmer with calloused hands and a marksman's eye. But then, that's what happens when you mistake a wolf hunter for prey. Next time, we'll see how Reed's careful preparations begin to bear fruit, and how one man's patience can become a whole town's salvation. The morning after Carson's murder dawned blood-red over Pine Valley, the sun struggling through clouds of smoke from his still smoldering ranch. Morrison's message couldn't have been clearer. Resist and face the consequences. But something else was happening in the valley, something that made even Morrison's hardened riders nervous. It started with the accidents, small things at first, easy to dismiss. Two of Morrison's men were tracking property lines near Reed's farm when their horses suddenly spooked, throwing them hard enough to crack ribs. They swore they'd heard nothing, seen nothing, just a flash of sunlight on metal from the distant hills. Another rider carrying messages to reluctant farmers found every trail to his targets blocked by mysteriously fallen trees or suspicious rock slides. Each obstacle seemed random, natural even, but they all had one thing in common: they'd been prepared days in advance, just waiting for the right moment. Sarah Cooper was counting inventory when Reed came in for his weekly supplies. His list had changed: less seed and farming tools, more rope, metal wire, and oddly specific amounts of gunpowder. "Planning on doing some blasting?" she asked casually, wrapping the packages. Lot of rocks still in that field of yours. Something like that. Reed smiled, but his eyes were focused elsewhere, watching Morrison's latest recruits drinking across the street at Parker's saloon. Though sometimes the best way to move a boulder isn't to break it, but to make it roll where you want it to go. Before Sarah could respond, young Billy burst into the store, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Mr. Reed, they're saying Lucas Morrison's coming, Wade's brother, the one they call the Butcher." Reed's reaction was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, but Sarah caught it. "Lucas Morrison," he said softly. "Now that's interesting timing." "You know of him?" Sarah asked, though something in Reed's tone suggested more than mere knowledge. "We've met." Reed's hand unconsciously touched his left side, where Sarah glimpsed the edge of an old scar through his worn shirt. 4 years ago, up in Dakota Territory, he was leading a gang terrorizing homesteaders there too, until someone stopped him. Someone? Billy leaned in, hungry for details. "A ghost," they said. "A shooter who could place a bullet through a man's gun hand at 400 yards. Never saw him, never knew where the shot came from. Just heard the crack of the rifle and watched their best guns drop." Reed's voice had changed, become distant, like he was reading from a memory. Lucas lost 3 fingers that day, and his taste for direct confrontation started sending others to do his killing for him. Sarah's mind was racing, connecting pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving. "That's why you chose this valley, isn't it? Why you spent months preparing your farm. You knew they were coming." Reed nodded slowly. "Been tracking the Morrisons for 2 years, watching their pattern. They always move the same way. Start with the outer valleys, work their way into the richest land. Pine Valley was next on their list. Just had to wait." "Wait for what?" Billy asked. "For them to think they had the upper hand. For them to get careless." Reed gathered his supplies. "Lucas Morrison's a cautious man now, won't move unless he thinks he has every advantage. But his brother, Wade's different. Pride makes him take risks, especially when he thinks he's dealing with simple farmers." As if on cue, shouting erupted from the street. 2 of Morrison's men were roughing up old Pete Williams, whose barn they'd burned. Pete's son, Jacob, came running to help, only to be pistol-whipped to the ground. Sheriff Hayes emerged from his office, but Morrison's other men had him covered. Reed didn't move, didn't even seem to be watching, but his voice carried an edge Sarah hadn't heard before. "Billy, remember that ridge where you've been watching my farm? The one with the old lightning-struck pine?" Billy nodded eagerly. "There's a package there, wrapped in oilcloth. Bring it to your grandmother after dark. And Billy?" Reed's eyes locked with the boys. "Don't let anyone see you." As darkness fell, Billy returned with a heavy bundle. Inside, Sarah found a precision rifle, the kind Army sharpshooters used, along with detailed maps of the valley marked with distances, wind calculations, and labeled positions. There was also a letter, written in Reed's precise hand. "Mrs. Cooper, what's coming isn't just about stopping the Morrisons. It's about showing good people they can stand against evil. That fear isn't the only way. I've spent months preparing this valley, shooting positions, escape routes, choke points where a single rifle can hold off 20 men. But a rifle's just a tool. What matters is the hands it falls into, and the hearts of the people it protects. The sheriff's a good man, but he needs to know he's not standing alone. Show him these maps. Show him there's a plan. And when the time comes, show him there are still people willing to fight for what's right." The next morning, Lucas Morrison rode into Pine Valley with 15 hard men at his back. He was easy to spot, left hand missing 3 fingers, face twisted in a permanent snarl. His first stop was Reed's farm, but he found only empty fields and carefully tended rows. No sign of the farmer, though the morning coffee pot was still warm on the stove. Lucas didn't like it. Something about the setup felt familiar, tickled old memories he'd rather forget. The precise arrangement of the buildings, the clear lines of sight to every approach. He'd seen work like this before, paid for it with his fingers. "Spread out," he ordered his men. Check every building, every field. Find him." That's when the first shot rang out. 400 yards away, from a position prepared months in advance, Marcus Reed adjusted his aim fractionally for the morning wind. Through his scope, he watched Lucas Morrison's face change from anger to recognition to fear. The man remembered him now, remembered the last time they'd met. Reed's finger tightened on the trigger. The war for Pine Valley was about to enter its final phase, and the ghost of Dakota Territory had returned to finish what he'd started. In our next part, we'll see how one man's careful planning and a town's rediscovered courage come together to face the storm that's about to break over Pine Valley. The first shot that rang out across Pine Valley didn't kill anyone. Wasn't meant to. Instead, the bullet struck the ground exactly 1 inch from Lucas Morrison's boot, throwing dust into the air. The message was clear. The next one wouldn't miss. The butcher of Dakota Territory stood frozen, his face a mask of old fears as 2 more shots cracked out in rapid succession, each kicking up dirt closer than the last, closer. "It's him," Lucas whispered, his maimed hand clutching reflexively at his gun belt. "The ghost." His men were already diving for cover, but Reed had spent months preparing this battlefield. Every piece of natural cover had been subtly altered. Logs that appeared solid were actually hollow and offered no protection. Rocks had been carefully positioned to deflect bullets in specific directions. Even the seemingly random arrangement of Reed's crops had been planned, creating clear lanes of fire that only became apparent when you were caught in them. "Scatter," Lucas bellowed, but that's exactly what Reed had been waiting for. As the riders broke in different directions, more shots rang out, not just from Reed's position, but from multiple points around the valley. Some were simple mechanical traps, triggers set off by carefully placed wires, but each shot was precisely aimed to drive Morrison's men exactly where Reed wanted them. In town, Wade Morrison burst out of Parker's saloon at the sound of gunfire, his own men scrambling to mount up. But Sheriff Hayes was waiting in his office door, badge gleaming, shotgun ready. "Wouldn't do that if I were you," he said calmly. Behind him stood a dozen townspeople, armed and determined. Sarah Cooper's voice rang out from her store's upper window, where she held Reed's precision rifle with practiced ease. "You've got trouble enough at your brother's position," she called down. "Might want to think carefully about opening a second front." Morrison's face darkened with rage. "You really think a few farmers with rusty rifles can stop me? I own 3 valleys south of here, and every man in them knows what happens to those who stand against me." "You own nothing," came a new voice. Old Pete Williams stepped forward, his face still bruised from the beating he'd taken. "You steal, you burn, you murder, but you don't own anything except fear, and we're done being afraid." Back at Reed's farm, Lucas Morrison and his remaining men had been herded into a natural bowl between 2 ridges. Every time they tried to break out, precise shots would drive them back. Not killing shots, something worse. Shots that proved the shooter could kill them any time he wanted, was choosing not to just to prove his control. "Show yourself," Lucas screamed, firing wildly at the surrounding hills. "Face me like a man. Like you faced those homesteaders in Dakota?" Reed's voice carried clearly across the valley, though no one could spot his position. "Like you faced their children when you burned their homes?" Another shot cracked out, taking Lucas's hat clean off his head. The butcher dropped to his knees, gun falling from trembling fingers. "We can deal," he shouted. "Whatever you want, money, land, name it." "What I want," Reed's voice was closer now, though still hidden, "is for you to carry a message to every other predator thinking of moving into this territory. Tell them about today. Tell them what happened when you thought you found easy prey and instead found a hunter." In town, Wade Morrison was quickly running out of options. More townspeople were emerging from their homes, armed and purposeful. He recognized faces, men and women whose land he'd stolen, whose lives he'd ruined in other valleys. They'd followed him here, drawn by word of Reed's stand, ready to reclaim what was taken. "This is bigger than one valley now," Sheriff Hayes said quietly. Word spread about what's happening here. Every community you terrorized, every family you drove out, they're all watching. All waiting to see if one town can break your grip. Morrison's hand twitched toward his gun. You really ready to die for this worthless dirt? No one's dying today, Reed's voice rang out. He stood on the roof of the saloon, rifle held casually at his side. No one had seen him move into position, hadn't heard a sound. Like a ghost. Unless you make it necessary. For the first time, real fear showed in Morrison's eyes. Reed's stance, his voice, the way he held the rifle. This was no farmer playing at resistance. This was a predator who had lured his prey exactly where he wanted them. Last chance, Reed continued. Ride out, leave the territory, never come back. Or find out why they called me Ghost in Dakota. Morrison looked around wildly, at the armed townspeople, at his brother's men trapped in the distance, at the mysterious shooter who had orchestrated it all. His empire of fear was crumbling, and he knew it. In that moment, Wade Timberwolf Morrison made his final mistake. He drew. What happened next became legend in Pine Valley. Those who saw it swore Reed never seemed to move, never seemed to aim. There was just the crack of his rifle and Morrison's gun flying from his hand, a perfect shot that left him alive but ended any threat he posed. In the distance, similar shots rang out, disarming the remainder of his men with surgical precision. The war for Pine Valley was over, ended not with a massacre but with a demonstration of such skill that it left no doubt about what could have happened if Reed had chosen to kill rather than warn. In our next part, we'll see the aftermath of Reed's victory and learn the true reason the Army's deadliest sharpshooter chose to become a farmer in a forgotten valley. As the dust settled over Pine Valley, the story of what happened there began to spread across the territory like wildfire. They say Wade Morrison's empire crumbled faster than it had been built, his remaining men deserting as word traveled of how the legendary Timberwolf and his brother had been outmaneuvered by a single farmer with a rifle. But the real story, the truth of who Marcus Reed was and why he'd chosen this valley for his stand, that tale waited to be told until the autumn harvest, when the fields he'd so carefully prepared finally bore fruit. The morning after Morrison's defeat, Sarah Cooper found Reed tending his crops as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The rifle that had changed the valley's fate was nowhere to be seen, replaced by familiar farming tools. But this time she noticed how he handled them differently, no longer playing the role of an awkward settler, but with the same precision he'd shown with his weapons. "You're really going to stay, aren't you?" she asked, watching him check his cornrows. "Even after everything's done." Reed straightened, surveying his land with eyes that could judge distance to the inch. "This was never just about stopping Morrison," he said finally. "That's why I didn't just shoot him the first day he rode in. Some things need to grow, take root, become stronger than any one person." As if to prove his point, wagons were already rolling into Pine Valley, families returning, the Hendersons, the Millers, all those who'd been driven out. But they weren't alone. With them came others, drawn by the story of how one small valley had broken the back of the territory's most feared outlaws. Sheriff Hayes found Reed later that day, as the autumn sun painted the valley in shades of gold. "Finally remembered where I'd heard about the ghost," he said, settling on Reed's fence. "Army records from after the war. They say you could have written your own ticket, any position you wanted in the federal marshals, railroad security, you name it." Reed nodded slowly. "They offered. Good money, important work. But I'd seen enough killing by then. Seen what violence does to both sides of any fight. Started thinking maybe the best way to stop evil isn't just to shoot it, but to give good people the courage to stand against it." "That's why all this?" Hayes gestured at the carefully tended fields. "The farming, the months of preparation?" "Farming teaches you patience," Reed smiled. "Shows you that the most important victories are the ones that take time to grow. I needed Morrison to see me as harmless, needed time to prepare the ground, both literally and figuratively. But more than that, I needed the valley to remember its own strength." Young Billy Cooper came running up, excitement written across his face. "Mr. Reed, they found Morrison's ledgers in his saddlebags. All the proof of his crimes, every crooked deal, every stolen property. The territorial judge is riding in tomorrow to start setting things right." Reed's smile deepened. "Justice grows best in fertile soil, Billy. Remember that." As weeks passed, Pine Valley began to transform. The returning families brought new energy, new determination. Reed's farm became a gathering place, not just for those wanting to learn about agriculture, but for anyone seeking to understand how one man's patient courage had changed everything. Late one evening, as autumn's first frost painted the valley silver, Sarah Cooper finally asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Why here? Of all the places Morrison terrorized, why choose Pine Valley to make your stand? Reed was silent for a long moment, cleaning his rifle with the same care he showed his farming tools. "During the war," he said finally, "I learned that the best position for a sharpshooter isn't always the highest ground. It's the place where everything comes together. Terrain, timing, purpose." Pine Valley wasn't just another target for Morrison. It was the keystone of his empire, the richest soil in the territory. Taking it would have given him control of all the surrounding valleys. He paused, checking his rifle's sight with practiced precision. But it was more than that. This valley. It's like the land itself wants to grow something good. The soil, the water. Now we plant different seeds. Reed stood, looking out over his fields where the evening light painted everything in shades of promise. Seeds of justice, of community, of standing together against whatever darkness comes. Morrison won't be the last wolf to eye this territory. But next time, they won't find scattered sheep. They'll find shepherds who know how to protect their own. As if to prove his words, the valley continued to flourish. The territorial governor, impressed by how one community had broken Morrison's grip, established a regional marshal's office in Pine Valley. Hayes took the position, with Reed quietly teaching him and his deputies the arts of patience and preparation that had proven so effective. But Reed himself refused all offers of badges or official positions. He had his farm to tend, he said, and sometimes the best way to protect something wasn't from a position of authority, but from the ground up, nurturing it like a tender shoot until it grew strong enough to weather any storm. They say on quiet evenings, you can still find him on his porch, rifle clean and ready but rarely needed now. He watches over his fields and the valley beyond, not as the ghost who haunted Dakota territory, but as the farmer who showed an entire territory that the strongest growth comes not from fear, but from courage planted in fertile soil and tended with patient hands. The story of Pine Valley and the sharpshooter who became a farmer still echoes through these parts, not just as a tale of how one man's skill with a rifle broke an empire of evil, but as a reminder that the most important victories are the ones we grow together, standing tall like wheat in autumn, ready to face whatever storms may come. And if sometimes, when trouble threatens the peace of neighboring valleys, ranchers report seeing a familiar figure watching from distant ridges, rifle in hand, well, some ghosts choose to linger, protecting the good things they've helped to grow. Winter came early to Pine Valley that year, bringing with it whispers of trouble from the north. The Morrison brothers were gone, but nature abhors a vacuum, and other predators had taken notice of how one small valley had brought down an empire. Among them was Xavier Red Hand Blackwood, a man who had made his fortune in the Dakota goldfields through means that made even Morrison look gentle. Word reached Reed one bitter morning as he was checking his winter wheat. Billy Cooper, now proudly wearing a deputy's badge of his own, rode up with news that made the veteran sharpshooter's eyes narrow. "Blackwood's men have been asking questions in Silver Creek," Billy reported, his breath frosting in the cold air. "About you specifically, about what really happened here." Reed continued his inspection, though Sarah Cooper, watching from her store porch, noticed how his movements had changed, become more measured, more precise. The farmer was fading, the ghost emerging once again. "Interesting timing," Reed mused, just as the passes are about to close with snow. "That's not all," Billy hesitated. "They say he's bringing something new, Gatling guns, 2 of them." This got Reed's full attention. The rapid-fire weapons could change everything, make his carefully prepared shooting positions worthless. But there was something in his eyes. Not fear, but the calm calculation that had served him so well before. "You know what most men don't understand about machines like that, Billy?" Reed asked, examining a wheat sprout with careful attention. "They think more bullets means more power. But a Gatling gun is just like any other weapon. It's only as good as its position, its timing, and the man using it." Sarah approached, her face tight with worry. "Marcus, even you can't outshoot a Gatling gun." "No," Reed agreed. "But I don't have to. Sometimes the best way to defeat a weapon isn't to fight it, but to make it useless." He turned to Billy. "Ride up to Carson's old place. Behind the burned barn, you'll find a cache of supplies I laid in months ago. Bring back the brass telescope and the survey maps." As Billy rode off, Sarah confronted Reed directly. "You knew something like this would happen, didn't you? Even after Morrison, you kept preparing." Reed's smile held no humor. "Peace is like farming, Mrs. Cooper. You don't just plant once and expect crops forever. You have to tend it, protect it, be ready for the storms that come." He looked north, toward the mountain passes. "Blackwood's not like Morrison. He doesn't want to own the valley. He wants to destroy it. Make an example of what happens to those who resist men like him." That evening, Marshal Hayes called a town meeting in the church. The community that gathered was different from the frightened settlers of 6 months ago. These were people who had stood against terror and won, who had learned that courage, like fear, could spread if given fertile ground. "Blackwood's coming," Hayes announced simply. "And he's coming for blood. Those Gatling guns can tear this town apart." "Then we stand again," old Pete Williams declared, his voice firm. "Reed showed us how last time." But Reed, standing quietly at the back of the church, shook his head. "Not like last time. This needs to be different. Blackwood's expecting a sharpshooter's tricks, expecting me to try to pick off his men from hiding." His eyes held that distant look that meant he was seeing things others couldn't. "So we give him something else entirely." The next morning, strange activities began in Pine Valley. Loads of timber were hauled to seemingly random locations. Wagons of stone were positioned at key points. To casual observers, it looked like the town was preparing defensive barriers, exactly what you'd expect when facing Gatling guns. But Sarah Cooper noticed how Reed supervised each placement with his sniper's precision, checking angles, measuring distances. "You're not building barriers," she realized, watching him sight along a timber line. "You're building something else." "Blackwood thinks he knows what he's facing," Reed replied quietly. "Thinks he's learned from Morrison's mistakes, but there's an old saying among sharpshooters. The target you see isn't always the target that matters." As the first snow began to fall, Pine Valley prepared for war once again. But this time, under Reed's guidance, they were preparing for a very different kind of fight. The ghost of Dakota Territory had one more lesson to teach about the nature of patience, preparation, and the true meaning of strength. And in the frozen passes to the north, Red Hand Blackwood was about to learn why some legends are best left undisturbed. 3 days of snowfall transformed Pine Valley into something otherworldly, a landscape of white broken only by the dark shapes of Reed's mysterious constructions. To untrained eyes, they looked like madness, wooden frames and stone piles arranged in patterns that made no obvious sense. But Sarah Cooper had learned to see beyond the obvious where Marcus Reed was concerned. She found him at dawn, checking measurements with the brass telescope Billy had retrieved. The instrument wasn't military issue. It was something else, something more precise. Like everything about Reed, it had a purpose beyond the obvious. "That's not just for spotting, is it?" she asked, offering him coffee. Reed adjusted the telescope's settings with practiced care. "It's a surveyor's transit. Spent 2 years with the railroad learning how to map terrain, calculate grades and angles." He smiled slightly. "Useful skills for a sharpshooter. Even more useful for what's coming." "And what exactly is coming?" The question came from Marshal Hayes, approaching through the knee-deep snow. Because right now, all I see is a lot of timber and stone placed where it won't stop a single bullet from those Gatling guns. That's because they're not meant to stop bullets. Reed's voice held that quiet certainty that had come to mean trouble for his enemies. They're meant to direct them. Every frame, every stone pile, they're like the banks of a river, channeling water where you want it to go. Understanding dawned in Hayes's eyes. You're creating killing grounds. No. Reed's denial was sharp. I'm creating choice points, places where Blackwood and his men will have to make decisions. And in weather like this with limited visibility, he gestured at the swirling snow. They'll make the choices I want them to make. The day brought more preparations, but not the kind anyone expected. Instead of digging defensive positions, Reed had the townspeople spreading hay and straw in specific places, creating paths that looked like natural routes through the snow. Each path led past his wooden constructions, past piles of stone that seemed randomly placed. Billy Cooper, watching from his favorite observation point, began to see the pattern. It's like a maze, he said excitedly, but one you can't see until you're in it. Smart boy, Reed nodded approvingly. In a snowstorm, men follow the path of least resistance. They'll take what looks like natural cover, move along the easiest routes. And those routes lead right where you want them, Billy finished. But what about the Gatling guns? Reed's smile held a predator's edge. A Gatling gun is just a complicated way of throwing lead, and like anything complicated, it has weaknesses. Weight, limited mobility in deep snow, fixed firing positions, but its biggest weakness? He pointed to the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains. Visibility. A Gatling gun is useless if you can't see what you're shooting at. That afternoon, Blackwood's scouts were spotted checking the passes. They were careful, professional, but they saw exactly what Reed wanted them to see. A town preparing typical defenses, seemingly unaware of the devastating power of rapid-fire weapons. Let them look, Reed instructed, when some of the townspeople wanted to drive the scouts off. Let them think they know what they're facing. Sarah found him that evening in his barn, methodically checking his rifle. But it wasn't his famous, long-range weapon. This was something different. A shorter, more versatile repeating rifle. No sniper rifle? She asked, surprised. A sniper's greatest asset isn't his rifle, Reed replied, working the action with practiced smoothness. It's his ability to control the battlefield, to shape it, to know every angle, every distance, every choice his opponent will face. He held up a single cartridge, studying it in the lamplight. One bullet can change everything, but only if all the pieces are in the right place when you fire it. As night fell, more news arrived. Blackwood's main force was moving through the passes, using the storm for cover. They had the Gatling guns, hauled on specially designed sleds, but they also had something else. Something that made Reed's eyes narrow when he heard about it. Dynamite, Billy reported breathlessly. Lots of it. They're saying Blackwood plans to make an example of Pine Valley. Not just defeat us, destroy us completely. Reed absorbed this information with his usual calm, but those who knew him saw the subtle changes. The way he checked his gear with extra care. The stillness that came over him. Not the stillness of fear, but of a predator preparing to strike. Good, he said finally, surprising everyone. Let them bring their dynamite. Sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy brings to the fight. That night, as the storm intensified, Reed gathered the town's defenders in the church. The plan he laid out was unlike anything they expected. No heroic last stands, no dramatic sniper shots from distant ridges. Instead, he spoke of timing, of pressure points, of how fear and limited visibility could turn a superior force's strength against itself. Tomorrow, he concluded, Blackwood will learn what Morrison learned. That Pine Valley isn't just land worth fighting for, it's land worth thinking for, ground worth planning for, and, most importantly, his eyes met each defender in turn. It's home to people worth protecting, by any means necessary. As the defenders dispersed to their positions, Sarah caught Reed's arm. You're not telling us everything, are you? There's more to your plan. There always is, Mrs. Cooper. Reed checked the chamber of his repeating rifle one final time. But sometimes, the best plan is the one your own people can't reveal, even under pressure. The night deepened, the storm howling like a wolf pack scenting blood. Somewhere in that swirling white darkness, Blackwood's forces were moving into position, confident in their superior firepower and explosive arsenal. But they were moving into a battlefield shaped by a master of angles and distances, a man who had spent months preparing for this moment. The next part of our story will reveal just how deep Reed's planning went, and how one man's patient genius could turn even the most powerful weapons against those who wielded them. Dawn never really came to Pine Valley that morning, just a gradual lightening of the storm's darkness to a ghostly gray. The snow fell in thick curtains, reducing visibility to mere yards, transforming familiar shapes into looming shadows. Perfect weather for an attack, most would say. But Reed had been counting on exactly this kind of day. The first sign of Blackwood's advance came as a deep rumbling through the frozen ground, the sound of heavy sleds carrying the Gatling guns. Through the swirling snow, dark figures emerged, moving exactly as Reed had predicted, following the paths of least resistance that he'd so carefully prepared. Right on schedule, Reed murmured from his position near the church. He wasn't using his scope. In this weather, eyes alone worked better. Besides, he'd memorized every distance, every angle months ago. Billy, signal the south ridge. Young Cooper raised a lantern 3 times, its light diffused by the snow into a ghostly glow. Moments later, an answering flash came from where Pete Williams and his men waited. Everything was in position. Blackwood's men moved with professional precision, securing what looked like advantageous positions among Reed's wooden constructions. The Gatling guns were placed exactly where any military commander would put them, on slight rises offering clear fields of fire toward the town, or what seemed like clear fields. "They're deploying the dynamite teams," Billy reported, watching through a brass spyglass. 4 men carrying satchel charges, just like you said they would. Reed nodded, checking his repeating rifle one last time. Confident men make predictable choices. Blackwood thinks he's learned from Morrison's mistake. Thinks overwhelming firepower is the answer to a skilled sharpshooter. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He hasn't learned the right lesson. The attack began with theatrical flourish. Xavier, red hand. Blackwood himself rode forward through the snow, his signature crimson gloves bright against the white landscape. His voice boomed across the valley, practiced and pompous. "To the people of Pine Valley, you've earned a reputation for resistance, for harboring a man who thinks himself clever enough to stand against progress. I'm here to teach you the cost of such pride." As if to punctuate his words, both Gatling guns opened fire, their savage drumbeat echoing off the mountains. Hundreds of rounds chewed through the snow, splintering wood and shattering stone. But Reed's careful preparations proved their worth. Most of the bullets were caught by hidden earthworks, or deflected by precisely angled timber frames. "Time to introduce some variables," Reed said calmly. He fired a single shot, not at any person, but at a specific stone pile on the valley's eastern edge. The impact dislodged a carefully balanced rock which tumbled down, triggering a cascade. The resulting avalanche wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. The thundering snow and rock sent Blackwood's men scrambling for new cover, exactly the positions Reed had prepared for them. "They're splitting up," Billy observed. "Just like you said they would." Reed was already moving, ghost-like through the storm. Fear makes men predictable. When faced with danger from above, they'll seek solid cover below. "Marshal?" Hayes's voice crackled through the wind. "Ready when you are." The next phase began with another single shot from Reed, this one striking a concealed cache of lamp oil near one of the Gatling gun positions. The explosion wasn't large, but in the swirling snow, it seemed massive. More importantly, it sprayed burning oil across the snow, creating a wall of steam and smoke that further reduced visibility. Blackwood's men, already nervous, began firing wildly at shadows. The Gatling guns roared again, but in the chaos and limited visibility, they might as well have been spitting lead into the ocean. Meanwhile, Reed's carefully placed townspeople began their part, firing from multiple positions, creating the illusion of a much larger force. "You're using their own weapons against them," Sarah Cooper realized, watching from the church tower. The snow, the terror of the Gatling guns, even their own dynamite teams. "Every weapon has two edges," Reed replied, moving to a new position with fluid grace. "A Gatling gun is fearsome when you can see your target. In a snowstorm with careful preparation," he gestured at the chaos below, "it becomes a source of fear for those using it." The battle reached its crescendo as Blackwood's dynamite teams, desperate to make an impact, began moving toward the town. But they found themselves caught in Reed's invisible maze. Paths that seemed to lead to the town actually circled back, bringing them under fire from their own Gatling guns. Through it all, Reed moved like his old namesake, a ghost in the storm, appearing and disappearing, each shot precise and purposeful. He never aimed to kill, but each bullet drove Blackwood's men exactly where he wanted them. The turning point came when one of the dynamite teams, thoroughly lost and panicked, sought shelter in what appeared to be a stable. Too late, they realized it was one of Reed's carefully prepared positions, and they had just trapped themselves with their own explosives. "Surrender now!" Reed's voice carried through the storm, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You're surrounded, your weapons are useless, and that stable you're hiding in. The support beam above your heads is rigged to collapse. One shot is all it would take." Blackwood's rage cut through the howling wind. "Show yourself, you coward. Face me like a man." "A man?" Reed's voice held something cold. "Men like you understand only one thing: power. So I'm showing you a different kind of power. Not the power to destroy, but the power to control. Every move you've made since entering this valley has been exactly what I wanted. Every position you've taken, every shot you've fired, all part of a plan months in the making." As if to prove his point, another series of controlled avalanches cut off Blackwood's escape routes. His men were now completely boxed in, caught in a trap so subtle they hadn't even realized it was closing until too late. The end, when it came, was surprisingly quiet. No dramatic final shootout, no heroic charges. Just the gradual realization by Blackwood's men that they were utterly outmaneuvered, caught in a web of somebody else's design. But the story wasn't quite over. Reed had one final lesson to teach about the true nature of power and justice, a lesson that would ensure Pine Valley's peace for generations to come. In our final chapter, we'll see how the ghost of Dakota Territory turned a would-be destroyer into an unwitting messenger, and how One Valley's courage became a beacon of hope for the entire territory. The storm that had aided Reed's strategy cleared at dawn the next day, revealing a transformed Pine Valley. Blackwood's fearsome force had been reduced to a huddle of cold, humbled men, their precious Gatling guns now silent monuments to the folly of believing that superior firepower alone guaranteed victory. But it was what Reed did next that truly set this victory apart from his triumph over Morrison. As the morning sun painted the snow-covered valley in shades of gold, he approached the captured Blackwood with an unexpected proposal. "You have a choice," Reed said, his voice carrying across the pristine morning air. "One that's more generous than you offered others." He stood before Blackwood, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "You can face territorial justice for your crimes. And believe me, we have enough witnesses now to ensure that happens. Or you can become something more valuable, a messenger." Blackwood, his signature red gloves now stained dark with gunpowder and defeat, sneered. "A messenger? Of what?" "Of truth," Reed replied simply. "The truth about what really happened here. Not just about how one man outmaneuvered your entire force, but about how one community stood together and proved that courage, properly prepared, can defeat any weapon." Sarah Cooper, watching from the church steps, saw something she'd never expected. Reed was offering not just mercy, but purpose. He wasn't just ending a fight. He was transforming an enemy into a tool for peace. "Why should I carry your message?" he Blackwood demanded, though there was something different in his voice now, something almost like respect. "Because you're a student of power," Reed answered. "You've built your reputation on understanding strength. So tell me, what's more powerful? The fact that I could have killed you and your men a dozen times over, or the fact that I chose not to? The Gatling guns that now lie useless in the snow, or the strategy that made them worthless?" He gestured at the valley around them, at the intricate network of preparations that had turned a superior force's strength against itself. "You came here expecting to find one sharpshooter, one man to defeat. Instead, you found an entire community that had learned to think like a sharpshooter, to use patience, preparation, and precision instead of brute force." As if to emphasize his point, the townspeople were already emerging not with vengeful anger, but with the quiet confidence of those who had learned their own strength. They began dismantling Reed's elaborate constructions, repurposing the materials for rebuilding and growth. "Your reputation will actually help spread the message," Reed continued. "When the notorious Red Hand Blackwood tells others about how his Gatling guns and dynamite were defeated not by superior firepower, but by superior thinking, well, that's the kind of story that makes men stop and reconsider their choices." Billy Cooper, now standing proudly beside his grandmother, understood what Reed was doing. "You're not just protecting Pine Valley anymore, are you? You're teaching others how to protect themselves." Reed smiled at the boy's insight. "The best victory isn't the one that leaves your enemy destroyed, but transformed. Changed in a way that helps others change too." In the days that followed, Blackwood did indeed become a messenger, though not in the way anyone expected. He stayed in Pine Valley, not as a prisoner, but as a student. Reed taught him not just about marksmanship and strategy, but about the deeper principles that had transformed a simple valley into something extraordinary. "Power isn't just about who has the biggest guns," Reed explained one evening, as they surveyed the valley from his porch. "It's about understanding the terrain, both the physical landscape and the landscape of human nature. It's about knowing when to shoot and when to grow something instead." The spring that followed brought more than just new crops to Pine Valley. It brought visitors, lawmen, community leaders, and, yes, even reformed outlaws, all coming to learn from the place where two of the territory's most feared forces had been defeated not by violence but by patience and preparation. Reed's farm became a school of sorts, though not the kind that taught traditional subjects. He taught principles: how to read terrain, how to prepare ground, how to build community defenses that didn't rely solely on guns, but most importantly, he taught people how to think like protectors rather than predators. Sarah Cooper, watching all this unfold, finally asked him the question that had been on her mind since the beginning. "You never intended to just save one valley, did you?" Reed looked out over his flourishing fields where wheat grew in patterns that could still serve as shooting lanes if needed, but now primarily yielded bread for a growing community. "During the war," he said quietly, "I learned that a sharpshooter's greatest skill isn't accuracy with a rifle. It's the ability to see patterns, to understand how small changes can have large effects. I realized the same principle could be applied to fighting evil. Sometimes the best way to stop violence isn't with more violence, but by teaching people how to make violence ineffective." As the years passed, Pine Valley became known not just as the place where the Ghost of Dakota Territory had made his stand, but as the birthplace of a new kind of courage, the kind that grew from soil enriched by wisdom rather than blood, that spread through example rather than force. They say on quiet nights, you can still find Reed on his porch, rifle clean and ready, but rarely needed now. He watches over fields that grow both food and strategy, teaching new generations that the strongest weapon isn't the one that destroys the most, but the one that helps good things grow. And if sometimes people still whisper about the ghost who became a farmer, well, that's all right too, because the real ghost story isn't about how one man's skill with a rifle defeated evil. It's about how he planted seeds of courage that would grow for generations to come, protecting not just one valley but an entire territory's hope for a better future.